Memories. They can bring us joy or pain, and sometimes just a sight, smell, or sound can bring us back to a specific time or place in our past. But for veterans, those memories could bring them back to a place of trauma. Stay with us as we talk about post-traumatic stress triggers and how to keep your fingers straight. Welcome to Veterans Voices. I'm Elena Kim. Anyone who served in the military has had the experience of a sight, sound, or smell transporting them back to a memory of their service. Tonight, we'll be talking about these things that trigger those memories, good or bad. First, let's join my co-host, Stephen Burchick, as he asks veterans that very question in A Vet on the Street.
My name is Stephen Burchick, and we're here with Veterans Voices. The segment today is Vet on the Street. We're gathered at the Veterans Memorial Building in Danville, where a lot of veterans are watching the annual Army-Navy game. Our question today is, what is a sound or smell or sight that reminds you of your time in the military?
Dennis Giacovelli, U.S. Navy. I still remember the sound of the helicopters, especially the Hueys. They make that whop sound. But whenever we were in trouble, we liked hearing that sound. They would come and save our butts. Smell, I don't know. I think maybe fireworks, because we used to do a lot of pop flares, and they have a very similar smell.
Hi, I'm Pat Leary, U.S. Army Aviation. So that question kind of easy for me. Number one is the sound of a helicopter. That brings back all kinds of memories. And number two is the smell. Even though I was a helicopter pilot, I ate more than my share of sea rations and baked beans. The smell of baked beans bring back memories. So thank you for asking.
Again, my name is Mike Mundell. I'm a U.S. Army officer and still currently serve in the Army Reserves. You know, that I think back to my deployment in Afghanistan, and I think it's something that probably most Americans can relate to. It's just the sound of any fighter aircraft. I'd take these walks around post at Bagram Air Base, and if you're out there still before dawn, many times the F-16s would come in from whatever mission they were flying, and literally be 200 feet above you in an otherwise really quiet environment. Just the sound of that airplane really did, just kind of validate everything you do in the military. It just kind of made you feel as if we're doing the right thing.
My name's Devin Washoe. I served in the United States Marine Corps, and I remember the incredible sound of mosquitoes. And in the middle of the night, you're out on patrol, and the sound of the mosquitoes just fills the air, and you can't imagine, how can it be so loud? And you imagine there's billions of them around you, and it's a pretty incredible sound. And also I remember the sagebrush. I think that's what that is in Camp Pendleton. That just reminds me of all those mountains we had to hump.
Well, hi, I'm Michelle Lee, and I'm a United States Air Force veteran, and I also on a board of a special district, which is a fire protection district. And the other day I went on a ride-along, and they were bringing out their SCBA, which is the breathing apparatuses they use during fires, and it reminded me of gas masks that I wore during my assignment in Europe. And we would have to sit around for hours in those gas masks at sometimes when the base was being closed or threatened through activity. So that's what it reminded me of, sitting around in gas masks for hours on end.
Michael Slatengren, United States Navy veteran. Probably the biggest thing that reminds me of my service is anything that I see that has to do with the currently serving military. I think back when I served back in the late 60s as a young, what was I? Well, teenager, late teens, early 20s, and what I was doing in order to serve my country, and had no idea what life was going to be like for me as I got out. But now that I see young veterans and young military, currently serving military, it reminds me of those days, and I get flashbacks every once in a while to those days that I served.
Okay. I'm Mark Heineman, U.S. Army Reserve, and the smell that really represents the Army to me when I smell it is the exhaust from diesel vehicles. I think back to all the diesel vehicles and power generators during my service, and that's my memory. And when I smell that, I think, yes, I remember those days, even though they were 50 years ago.
Welcome back. Like these veterans, we all experience things in our daily lives that trigger memories. But what if those same things also triggered negative feelings like fear, dread, or even danger? Tonight, we'll talk about post-traumatic stress triggers. A lot of folks in the veterans community have gone through trauma. If you're watching live, we want you to be a part of this conversation. Call us at 925-313-1170. Send us a message through Facebook at Veterans Voices 1, or email us at veteransvoices@contracostatv.org. We want to hear from you. We're aware that our conversation may trigger some veterans, so we'll be showing the number for the Veterans Crisis Line throughout the show. My host tonight is Army veteran Stephen Burchick, and I want to introduce tonight's guests, clinical psychologists Dr. Tara Neavins and Dr. Jeffrey Kixmiller, and Army veteran Therman McCormick.
Therman, you've had some firsthand experience with post-traumatic stress, and you now mentor or have mentored other veterans. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience and the journey?
Well, I was a combat infantryman in Vietnam in 1967-68, and we would run patrols, and patrols weren't going to last maybe 10, 15, 20 days. Would be out in the field, and we had to pack everything that we were going to use and chase them people all over the country, waiting. And that was stressful because you didn't know what was on the other side of that bush, that hill, and it put a lot of stress on you. I went over weighing 165 pounds. I came back weighing 128.
Wow.
And that was from the stress, I guess, or something like that.
Yeah.
And then I went to the vet center, and somebody told me about it, and I was hesitant. I didn't want to do it because I didn't think there was anything wrong with me. So once I got over there and they start talking about it, and I said, yeah, I guess there was something wrong with me. So then I went to a lot of, the one guy had a 18-month combat course. Everybody who was in combat was in that. There were 11 of us, and we spent 18 months together, and we talked about our experiences, and each one of us, it was almost mirroring each other. And then once we got through that, then I started seeing, hey, this is really working, because I really didn't trust it at first. I said, I don't know about these people because they haven't done what I went through. And so once I got there and got comfortable and they talked about it and I listened, I wasn't too much of a contributor to the conversation, but by listening, it helped me. So then, a few years down the road, then the Iraq and Afghanistan started, and then that world, I forgot what they called it. But anyway, they start coming in, the younger vets. And one day, one of the counselors says, hey, how about you guys trying to mentor? We all said, no, you talking? No, we're not going to do that. They don't know anything. And we didn't really want to come kind of join with them. Mm-hmm. There's a different age.
Separation, yeah.
Separation. I was, 50 or almost close to 60 when I did it. So then I said, okay, me and the one other guy, he comes here quite a bit, Joe and myself, so we started. And listening to them talk, and then finally I said, hey, wait a minute, you know, they've gone through the same thing that I did, you know? So we had a camaraderie there that was building. And then we told them how we cope with things, you know?
Speaking of coping, the show is about triggers. You've probably had triggers of your own. They had triggers. Were any of them common to both groups? Or?
Yes, they were.
What were some of them?
Some of the noises, loud noises, you know, like you'd be sitting there doing something, all of a sudden you hear somebody slam something. What's the first thing you do? You jump. You know, you're ready to see where it's coming from, you know. And that was one of my triggers, bad. And being bumped and pushed, you know, I don't like that. I don't like people touching me. Ever since I came back, you know, you just want to go move around, and you go someplace, people bumping you, they're not watching what they're doing, and that would trigger me. I'd get mad. I'd say, you know, tell them, why are you bumping me, you know? Get away from me. I don't like you. Yeah.
I wanted to ask Therman, from the time that you got out of the military to the time that you walked into the vet center, how long was that time period for you?
30 years.
30 years.
Because I got out when I was 22.
And so for that 30-year time period, when these triggers were coming up, did you identify them as that?
No,
or?
I didn't, because I didn't know what they were. I didn't know why I was angry all the time. I didn't know why. If somebody comes up and they their voice raises, that's one of my triggers. I get, wait a minute, what do you know, and I'll start backing away, because I don't like people getting aggressive, because I'll do something.
So it took 30 years from the time you got out of the military to walk into a vet center. That entire time you're feeling these triggers, but you don't know what to call them.
Exactly.
At what point in your life did you learn how to identify the triggers?
Well, it was when I was getting close to retiring. The job didn't need me.
From your civilian
From
job.
my civilian job. My kids were going to college. They didn't need me anymore. So I kind of felt like, gee, nobody needs me anymore. Why am I sticking around? You know, it got to that point where I said, you know, hey, there's no reason for me to be around. And I started getting those thoughts. And I was talking to some friend of mine. He said, you know, maybe you should check into the vet centers. I said, they can't help me. They don't know what's wrong with me. And then I went, and all of a sudden we start talking, and then I realized, hey, wait a minute. I worked all those years not knowing what was wrong with me. Nobody told me. Nobody told me about anything. They just cut me loose, and I fended for myself. And like you said, I worked for 15 years before anybody even knew I was in the military, in my job. They wondered, does he talk? I wouldn't talk to many people.
Okay. You mentioned, you know, loud sounds, people bumping into you, and some other things. I've heard some vets say that a date on the calendar is sometimes a trigger. Is that something you experienced?
Yeah, something like that. But what really was a bad thing for me was the weather. Every time it would get cloudy, rainy, well, as you know, choppers don't fly. And you could almost guarantee something was going to happen. You were going to get mortared, you were going to get shot at, or something like that, because they knew there was nobody there to support you. You know, you couldn't call in artillery. You'd be looking, well, the cloud's right there. Maybe shoot, you know, for a marking round or anything like that. You know, so it was kind of fearful for us. And that's exactly what you're saying. I get jumpy and nervous when it's cloudy like that. And
I think that's interesting, because we've heard about the sounds and the things that trigger, but you're really talking about lack of sound in this case. And I've heard that before with some of the younger veterans as well, is this the silence that could be a trigger. So I think that's important to keep in mind too. It might not be a loud noise, it might be the actual silence.
The actual silence sometimes is worse, yeah.
Yeah.
But so those are some of the things that... that trigger me.
There was a long period of time there, 30 years, and these triggers are going off, but you're not sure how to respond to them. If one of the doctors could make a quick comment, I'm sure there's a medical term for it or something on what's going on when you're not recognizing it, and then 30 years later, somebody helps uncover it. Dr. Tara, or Dr. Kixmiller?
Oh, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. That is very, very common to not present the VA or the vet center somewhere until decades later. And sometimes people cope with substances or just by working really hard. And when they retire, as you've been saying, Therman, you realized that you had lost the meaning in your life and you didn't feel needed anymore. And so we love to see people right after their deployments, after they've finished the military, so you don't have to wait 3 decades. Dr. Kixmiller, did you have more to add?
Yeah, I would just add that, we've talked a lot about kind of the external triggers that can occur, but there's also internal ones. And that can be you hinted at that, Therman, in terms of being upset, being angry, feeling lonely, feeling abandoned. Sometimes even relaxation feelings can be triggering because they feel like you're not on your highest defense. And so the internal ones come from inside the body, and we don't always have an external reason for it, but we can usually relate it with time to something that it's related to. The external ones are often unpredictable, and they can be really shocking, and then they cause all sorts of a cascade of very excitatory chemicals in your body that keep you really ramped up, and it's not easy to calm down afterwards.
And one thing to add is that people in different service time frames may have different triggers. So people in OEF, OIF, OND may be triggered when they're driving down the highway and they see a box because they're thinking it's an IED. Whereas Vietnam, it might be more helicopters and aircraft. And so it's really important to think about, even if you haven't heard your triggers today, you're probably experiencing some. Smells too, very much related to memory.
I'm curious, how can, because Therman mentioned earlier that it really wasn't until his children left the house where he started to have that self-reflection. And then you're mentioning, Dr. Neavins, that we do want to catch veterans earlier, if at all possible, when they leave the military service. What role does the family play in identifying those triggers or helping the veteran identify those triggers? Would you say it's helpful for a family member to have that conversation with their veteran, or what would you recommend?
Yeah, very much. One of the things I usually do when I do an intake, when I initially meet with a veteran, is that they come with someone, or a family member. I always ask if they want to have that person in the room, because the veteran will say oftentimes, I sleep fine. And then the bed partner will say, no, you wake up 5 times in the night, you throw out the sheets, you have hot flashes. You have night terrors, and so that information is really important. And lots of times family members will notice it before the veteran does.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to make a point. I think before you talked about triggers, and you said sometimes there's a situation and you try to get yourself out of that. Is that always practical to remove yourself from a situation?
It's not always practical, but if you have the chance to do it, it's a good way to do it, to move yourself back. Like at work, sometimes somebody would do something that I thought I was right on, and they would say, no, you're not, and that would, I'd get really mad, and then I'd say, well, wait a minute, let me back off here to myself. I'm always talking to myself, trying to make sure that I don't do something stupid, So I have to do this. For a trigger like that, say, wait a minute, I'm back off here, I'll go over here and do something else. And that helps me a lot when I get triggered like that. But, but like you said, when you said, I had all of that time, but nobody told me that there were vet centers out there. Nobody told me that I could go get help. They cut me loose and that was it. And when I come from a culture that's not the same as you, so they weren't aware. They were aware that I had changed, really changed. So they didn't want to have nothing to do with me. They kind of pushed back, So they kind of let me stumble around. And
I just want to highlight one thing you're saying, Therman, too. That pause is so important. So when you're dealing with a trigger, especially if you can't leave a situation, just taking a step back as you do and say kind of like, what am I missing? Is there someone else I can check with? Is there really danger here? Those are wonderful techniques to use.
yeah.
I think we're going to talk a little bit more about coping with triggers, but I'm curious, for the younger veterans, when they're first coming in, or new veterans, because they might be older veterans coming in for the first time, right? What are some things that you talk to them about to help them identify what's going on inside of them, but they don't have those words to share?
Well, you have to listen first. You have to listen and hear what he's saying. How was it when you went into combat? What did you do? What situation were you put in? Was somebody killed, or were you wounded? And then you go from there.
Yeah.
That's how I did it.
Start off by listening.
Yeah, I listened to them and say, well, this is the way I'd cope with something like that. If my friend got shot, what did I do? How did I help him? Did I stay there with him, or did I move out? You know, you have to evaluate that situation that he's in, and then you put yourself, or what experience you had.
You're sharing your experience,
Right,
but
with
you're starting off by allowing that veteran to share their experience.
You want to listen
first.
to them,
Yeah.
and then you put your, your little 2 bits in,
Yeah.
and help them, because they'll listen. If you experience the same thing they did, they will listen to you even more. And since I'm older, they listen to me. I still have people, younger vets, say, come and talk to me.
And I'm curious, who was it for you, Therman, when you first walked into the vet center that listened?
Well, it was a counselor, and we didn't get along to begin with. I told him how I felt, and I said, you know what, you're pulling the wool over my eyes, but I didn't say it like that. I told him, off and stuff. But then I realized when I went home, like she said, I took myself away from there, and I said, wait a minute, maybe he is right. So then I went back for the second time.
And did you switch up counselors for a little bit or stay with the same?
No, I stayed with the same guy until later on. Then he passed me on to somebody else, which was good.
Yeah.
Because I didn't have him.
I think that's an important message to our veterans to remember that if you go in once and you try it and it's not working out, try it again, come back, and you might find that the next person has something better to offer. When we come back, we're going to continue our discussion.
Honestly, I'm not really sure why I'm calling. It's just...
I'm having nightmares.
My husband and I, we're just fighting a lot.
I can't get any sleep.
Things just keep getting worse, and it's starting to feel like I can't do this by myself anymore.
We could use some help figuring things out.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you called. Why don't you tell me more about what's going on? There's no wrong reason to reach out for crisis support. Whatever you're going through, the Veterans Crisis Line is here to help. Visit veteranscrisisline.net to learn more.
If you're watching live, we invite you to be a part of the conversation. Call us at 925-313-1170. Send us a message through Facebook at Veterans Voices 1, or email us at veteransvoices@contracostatv.org. We want to hear from you. We're aware that our conversations may trigger some veterans, so we'll be showing the number for the Veterans Crisis Line throughout the show.
Dr. Shauna Springer, a longtime advisor to the show and associate, used to have a point that she frequently made, that she didn't like the term post-traumatic stress disorder. She preferred to refer to it as an injury rather than a disorder. I'm interested in how we feel about it. Dr. Neavins, can you give us your take on the difference between those two terms?
Sure, I've talked to Dr. Springer a lot about this, and I totally agree with her. As a psychologist, I am asked to use a diagnostic manual of disorders, the DSM-5, and that labels it as post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's basically normal people responding to extremely horrible circumstances and traumas. So either things that they've witnessed or experienced directly, whether it be sexual violence or combat or any other horrible situation, injury. And they're doing the best that they can to make sense of a senseless situation.
Dr. Kixmiller, does that fit with your beliefs?
Yeah, I would say it does. And I think it as Dr. Neavins was saying, that it really is a normal experience. And it can be something that kind of does kind of go away or stick around. And it's when it's sticking around, affecting relationships, work, just your own quality of life, that's a good time to potentially look for some assistance with, managing that. And there's common kind of other clumps of symptoms that go along with post-traumatic stress. It can be avoidance and isolation to kind of avoid those triggers. Like Therman was saying, I don't like people touching me. So that might mean that he stops going to stores where that might be happening. And there's can be emotional numbing where you kind of stop feeling as full. And sometimes that's just quelling anger and frustration. And so there's various kind of ways that PTS shows itself in different ways with different people.
Is there a standard set of steps that everybody who has PTS should go through? Is that how you handle clients?
In terms of treatment or, okay. Yeah, I mean, there are different, I know we're talking a little bit more treatment later on too, but I guess just in terms of diagnosing it, people can present very differently. And so as Dr. Kixmiller is saying, there are 3 basic criteria. There's also re-experiencing, which most people when they leave the military, they have nightmares. They have thoughts that they can't get out of their head. They are what we call hypervigilant, where they respond very strongly to cues. Like if I tap someone on the shoulder, they would probably, wonder what's going on. And if you have PTS symptoms, it would be more marked than that, more pronounced. Dr. Kixmiller, things to add?
Yeah, I would just say that Therman was on it. The coming in and talking to somebody can be extremely difficult for veterans because it seems like something's wrong and they, obviously don't want there to be anything wrong, but listening to them because it portrays itself in different ways with different people, with different family structures in their history, all sorts of ways. So one person's PTS can look quite different than another person's, even though once you get them all talking, there's some usually common ground like Therman discussed in his group.
I think earlier, Dr. Neavins, you mentioned that you also work with folks who are struggling with substance abuse, and I know somebody mentioned comorbidity issues. And TBI as well. Can you talk about how some of these things interact with those triggers and maybe some things that veterans should be aware of when they're dealing with more than just PTSD?
Sure, I can begin. One of the hallmarks of PTSD is avoidance. So oftentimes people first recognize that there are issues because you have a certain, world and you have friends and family members and work perhaps. And then as you're getting more symptoms, your world starts shrinking. And you notice that maybe you're not paying as much attention to the friends, you're not going out places. COVID-19 really worsened symptoms for a lot of people because they were isolated in their homes. With symptoms, you may start drinking more or using drugs to try to cope with the triggers. And as Dr. Kixmiller said, emotional numbing often happens too, where you're just not necessarily depressed, you're just not feeling really anything. And so avoidance goes hand in hand with PTSD.
And Therman, as a mentor coming from that background, because I don't know if you struggled with those other issues in conjunction with PTSD, but if you have a veteran who is struggling with alcohol or substance use, in addition to these triggers, and they're worried about coming in for help because they're worried about that judgment, or they're worried that, I'm just too far down the line, I can't get help with this. What are some of the things that you can talk to a veteran about to pull them in a little bit more?
Well, I usually go with them. I go with them and I show them and I talk to the people. I used to have some good friends that were counselors and stuff at the vet center there. And I'd go in there with the guy. I'd take him down there. I'd say, you know what? I can't help you. I'm not a doctor. I can listen real good, but I can also take you down there and I'll help you with it. I'll go in there with you. And a lot of times they're agreeable.
Yeah, I think that's so important,
Yeah.
absolutely, whenever you can.
Yeah, because I'm not a doctor or anything, but I know enough to take a person in,
Yeah.
and try to help them that way. I can do things for him and help him, drive him in if he doesn't want to drive, and it's helped a couple.
Yeah, I think that speaks again to the importance of having that family member, having that support person. It doesn't have to be a family member, right? It could be a peer support person, or even somebody that you do get along with at a VA hospital that could walk you to the behavioral health clinic or the mental health clinic and help you with that, or a vet center if you're concerned about walking into a VA hospital.
Yeah, I was more comfortable with the vet center, because it was loose, it was comfortable.
Yeah.
When I first started with the VA over in Martinez, it was too structured and they wanted to write everything down and they wanted to put their white coats on. And I was thinking, wait a minute, I'm the one that wants to talk. I don't want to hear what you got to say. So that was one of the things that helped me, is being able to, but then I didn't do it in a nice way. I just got to say, hey, I'm leaving.
Yeah.
I don't want to hear from you.
It's interesting, sitting here in between two Vietnam veterans, the vet centers really came out of that era, and it was conceptualized as something that Vietnam veterans felt a little bit uncomfortable going to the VA hospital because they were very sanitized buildings at that time. And so they wanted to have a location that felt a little bit more comfortable. Dr. Kixmiller and Dr. Neavins, talk to us a little bit about how that's maybe changed in the recent years, especially in the past 10 years. There's just been so many developments with mental health in VA.
Yeah, I think Vietnam vets have been very informative in the subsequent training of mental health providers. The message was maybe slow to getting to the VA, but it got through, I think. And there is great effort at trying to really meet vets where they are and not have too much structure. There's efforts at trying to make the surroundings more comfortable, more private, for very good reasons. Like, it can be very triggering going into that. And I would say that it's really great when someone like Therman, another vet, can help someone find care wherever that is, because you've been there, you've done that, you've shared things that can make it a lot easier to walk through those doors.
Yeah, and we have a very good relationship with the vet centers. I love when people go to both places. And so if someone goes to the vet center, we can't see their information. We can't see any of their data, but the vet centers can see the VA data. So it's a very interesting communication. And we serve LGBT veterans. We serve a lot of younger veterans, women veterans. It's not the VA it was 10, 20 years ago. Still some work to be done. And whenever I start an intake, again, I look at the person, I listen. I don't, worry about CPRS, our data system. I want to talk with the person first. The paperwork can come second.
We've got a viewer question here that I want to share, and hear a response from our guest tonight. This veteran says, I sometimes feel that getting help for triggers, for PTSD, may be more work than dealing with the triggers. I've already learned to deal with those. It seems like our conversation here is talking about, what are some of those coping methods that I can do on my own to kind of get past this?
You can only do so much on your own. It comes to a point where you have to trust other people and go in and see what they can do, how they can help you. So, I tried that myself. I tried to do a lot of that on my own, but it only worked to a certain point. I just needed a little bit more. I needed the medication. I needed the medication. I need that to stay. And it's not like, there was a really good doctor over, Dr. Colton, and she helped me, and she read about me being Native American, that I couldn't take as much dosage as, say, somebody who was white, Caucasian. I couldn't take as much. So she balanced my pills out, and boy, it worked wonders for me. I could take it, because when I first went there, she gave me something that was a little too, kind of like drooling out. I told her, you know what, I don't want to take this anymore. I said, I'm drooling out of the side of my mouth. And she goes, oh, well, let me check and we'll make another appointment. And she got my pills balanced. So
I think that's such an important point. First off, in that example, you're advocating for yourself. You're sharing your experience with your providers, right? And especially when it comes to medication, because a lot of veterans have fear of medication. So we've got another question from a veteran here. Are there coping methods that don't involve medication that maybe you could share with our viewers? Dr. Kixmiller, I see you nodding. Do you have some ideas there?
I think we'll be hitting those in the next segment the most. But yes, thankfully there are all sorts of, some are quite simple, some a little bit more involved. As one of your readers or kind of the vets that send something, you don't always need treatment to manage triggers either. There are non-therapy ways potentially of managing them and sometimes, moving on with them. So it's important that we're going to be talking about that. I'm just afraid if we start right now, we're going to almost cut it off before we get started.
Yeah. And I would say too, there's breathing techniques, there's seeking out support from other people. And to the earlier caller, I think you can manage triggers very well on your own to a certain point. And it's kind of short-term consequences versus long-term. So many of my folks, they drink, they manage their triggers that way, and it works for a period of time, and then it doesn't work anymore. And then when it's no longer working, we kind of call it white knuckling, more addictions, but it works for PTSD too, that you're just holding on. You're like, I'm just not going to do this. I'm going to get through it. I'm going to get through that 7:00 Saturday movie. I'm going to figure out a way. And it just becomes too much. So you're not necessarily in recovery, really actively addressing those triggers.
I was wondering on a slightly different topic, the role of education or vocational training to get the veteran to focus on means of self-support. Does that have a role in overcoming PTS or avoiding other problems? And I know the VA provides educational benefits, et cetera. Is that ever used as a way to help people?
Absolutely. I would only say that some of the people who seek help with their triggers might have found that the triggers are interfering with their efforts at trying to go back to school or work. And so sometimes that is the motivation to show up and say, I've got to be able to sit in this classroom and deal with the myriad of people that are here and the professor I can barely stand listening to, but it's the class I've got to take, or a new job that's very new, very triggering in all sorts of ways. That's when some people go, wow, I'm not handling this well enough by myself. And that's sometimes when we can help. Work can be fantastic as a therapy.
Yeah, and it's also the type of work. Sometimes people will go into night security, which can kind of just feed the PTSD symptoms because you're alone, you're isolated, you're, maybe overreacting to certain things that are going on. So finding the job that really makes the most sense to help, get back into the community, getting to see people. Yeah, work can be very helpful when people are ready. They might need more treatment first to help them get to the point of going back to work.
Almost sounds like we're talking about two different sides of the same coin, right? In one case, we're talking about veterans going to work and being triggered. And then we talked earlier about social isolation. I can imagine how having a job and being around the right folks, right, the right environment could be central to somebody improving their mental health. So very good question, Steve.
Yeah, definitely.
Therman, did you were working the entire time and experiencing these triggers, And it wasn't until things started calming down in your life were you working at the time still, or did
Oh
you
yeah,
retire?
I was working.
You were working during that time,
and
so.
and I had a stressful job.
Yeah.
You know, it's not. It's something that as soon as it was like the banks, if one of their main lines failed, they couldn't do business. So they were on the phone to you, and within 30 minutes, you had to have an answer or know where the problem was. So that coming out of combat and going into that kind of a job, I excelled at it.
Yeah.
But if it was too stressful, I'd go home. I may not come to work the next day.
I hear that a lot from veterans, that it's the same things that they learned in combat that make them really effective in their new job, but you have to think about how that's affecting you. So when we return, we're going to conclude our conversation about post-traumatic stress triggers.
In our country's time of need, you were there for us. Now it's our turn to be there for you.
Welcome to the VA.
Your VA is rapidly expanding veterans' benefits for those exposed to herbicides and burn pits in the past 60 years. From healthcare to compensation, hundreds of thousands of veterans are now eligible for new benefits. Hi, I'm Dr. Hoy. How can I help? To enroll or learn more about what VA can do for you or a loved one, visit va.gov/PACT or call 1-800-MY-VA-411.
About post-traumatic stress triggers. If you're watching live, we invite you to be a part of the conversation. Call us at 925-313-1170. Send us a message through Facebook at Veterans Voices 1, or email us at veteransvoices@contracostatv.org. We want to hear from you. We're aware that our conversation may trigger some veterans, so we'll be showing the number for the Veterans Crisis Line throughout the show.
How about we spend some time on solutions? What are ways that veterans can respond to triggers and hopefully improve their lives? Either doctor?
Yeah, I can start. So as we've been talking about, there are many ways to get treatment, and some people need treatment, some people don't. So if it's still getting in the way of your work and your social relationships, you've noticed you've been divorced 5 times, things are not working out well, maybe there's some legal issues, that may be the time to seek treatment. Just briefly, not to get too technical, but there are several different therapies. One is called cognitive processing therapy. That's dealing more with what we call stuck points. So things that you're telling yourself, like let's say you were sexually assaulted, I shouldn't have been going to that place. I shouldn't have been drinking X, Y, and Z. Nothing that had anything to do with why you were violated, but you believe that it was your fault, or you're in combat. I shouldn't have taken that order. I should have taken that order, whatever did or did not happen. So it deals with those things. There's prolonged exposure, which deals with repeating elements of the trauma over and over again, doing written and verbal accounts. We have something called EMDR, which is, you might have seen the eye processing, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. There's something called brain spotting. And then the other therapy that's been shown by research to be effective is written exposure therapy, which is basically just writing the account, but without talking a lot about it. So it's a little bit of a lighter weight treatment. And then also medication may be helpful. Neither of us prescribe medication, but there's a medication called prazosin, which is really great for targeting nightmares. And sometimes people might need antidepressants, but normally we don't look too much at anti-anxiety medication because people tend to get addicted. But Dr. Kixmiller.
Yeah, I would just add those are treatments that are really evidence-based and work well. We also know that, some vets need help as soon as they show up. They're showing up in some sort of pressured way, really having issues, and we try to help them have some tools, coping tools, and stress reduction strategies as early as possible. Some of those can sound really hokey. They're hard sometimes to believe that they can work, but they're in line with whole health nowadays, with controlled breathing, which a lot of veterans will say that's like when they were learning to shoot well, that was maybe the calmest they could have their physiology, is learning how to really slow down that. Exercise can be fantastic. There are things like just basic problem solving, finding out where the most common triggers are occurring in a person's life and trying to manage those in ways that isn't just avoiding them. Because like Dr. Neavins said, if you avoid them, you're kind of then stuck from places that you really might want to be. And so it's really trying to calm down the physiology, and things like yoga and exercise and working out with weights can all be really good ways of slowing down and using that kind of excitatory buildup in the body.
Yeah, and back to the breathing. So one of the easiest techniques is just really breathing from your stomach. We call it diaphragmatic breathing. But when we get nervous and stressed, we start breathing like this, very slow and choppy. So you want deep breathing, trying to exhale longer than you inhale. When I was becoming a psychologist, I thought this was really hokey. I was like, this breathing, does this really work? It works. I've been through a lot of pain issues. It works very well. We also do a lot of comorbid treatments, so working with other providers and things. So if you have like a traumatic brain injury or you have other things you might need, which I like about VA, so it's like one-stop shopping. You get everything in one place. And the last thing I wanted to say was the treatments. You're not going to be in treatment with us for 3 or 4 years. These treatments are 12 to 16-week treatments. And we really are able to work with most of the symptoms in a relatively short period of time. So it's not just long-term supportive therapy.
I would add that, like Therman pointed out, how isolation can really make triggers even more triggering and feeling overwhelmed. And yet when he helps people, other veterans, through kind of things that are triggering, that can be highly beneficial. And then that gives exposure to the triggers, and it is a way of the brain getting back past it. So, social support of the family, of friends, sometimes maybe sharing with a professor or an employer that you might have some stress issues. I mean, that's going to be carefully thought about, but those can be really helpful supports for the triggering that might occur. Sometimes when I'm upset, I'm going to go, is it okay, boss, if I go walk around the parking lot, take 15 minutes to just go calm down. And most of the time, those sorts of things can be supported in all sorts of situations.
Yeah, and the thing about volunteering, perhaps you're not ready to go back to work. Volunteering is a great way to get your feet wet and to see what may or may not be helpful for you and to give back to others. So I applaud you, Therman, for everything you've done as VA, as a mentor for veterans.
I love that the VA is getting so much more involved in these alternative therapy treatments, and I think that those are an excellent way to ease the veteran into treatment, into healthcare at the VA, so I definitely applaud that. I was curious, Dr. Neavins, you talked about how even as a provider, sometimes the breathing techniques, you thought they were a little hokey. Does anyone have a story to share about a veteran who walked in and said, "What? You want me to do what?" And they had that doubt or they had that confusion maybe, and how did that turn out for that veteran?
I think he's got one.
No, when I was going to the vet center, I had a young Air Force counselor, and one of the things that she told me was, you got to think of running water and putting a leaf on there and watching it go. And I'm looking at her and going, are you serious? Because I've never heard, I didn't hear it. She was so, you got to look at that river going down and the leaf going. But it works. Now, when I get kind of stressed, I'll think of that, because I did. At my grandmother's place, there was a little creek that ran, and water ran usually all year round.
Yeah.
And we used to play there, and now I look at that and I think back to that. So she was right.
I love it.
Yeah. But when she first told me, I said, nah, come on.
Takes a little bit of
So
time.
I was laughing at when she was saying that about, alternative things, and I was thinking about her, and it works.
I love that story because whenever you're triggered now, I feel like you're going to think of that Air Force veteran.
Yeah, and I think about, but I think about the little stream and I put a leaf on there, and it goes, and it works.
You don't know what's going to work until it works for you, right?
Yeah, when she first said it, I was thinking, oh, I'm going to have to change pretty soon.
Yeah, I try to really put it out there. There are all kinds of tools in the toolbox, right? There's a smorgasbord, a buffet of options. And I like to tell people we're the Home Depot. You come here, we have tools, we have things you can try out, and you go home, you go somewhere, you do your stuff. If it doesn't work, come back. But we're not the car mechanic. We're not here to fix you. We can't fix you. And so it's really about what you're putting in. And I'm very used to people being very angry and upset when they first see me. That all rolls off my back, and I just try to see what's going to work best for them. And I know people are not always in the best place when they first meet with me. As team lead, I get the more conflict-driven situations, and that's fine. I'm energized by it.
Love that Home Depot analogy.
Yeah. You mentioned different treatments and tools. Dr. Shauna Springer had spent some time on a couple of the shows talking about SGB, stellate ganglion block, as maybe a little stronger method where there's some physical work being done. Dr. Kixmiller, are you familiar with that procedure?
Yeah, I've had a number of veterans that I've worked with that have been referred to that in Martinez, and Dr. Fernandez is phenomenal. That's a way of turning down the sympathetic jive up nervous system, and it's does include a needle, but it's painless, and it really can work well. I have a veteran I'm working with right now that was an Iraq veteran. He came back. He then became a fireman, a first responder, and it was a really nasty car accident that triggered both PTSD for that event and other things. And then it bled into some of the things that happened with Iraq. And he's really been working hard on these other things, techniques and strategies that we use. He went ahead and had a stellate ganglion block, and it's probably the most effective I've ever seen. It just completely calmed him down. And he describes just feeling like he's no longer on a gas pedal of 95 miles an hour all the time, which now is making it much easier to practice things like controlled breathing and relaxation and mindfulness and all of those things. Before, it was still pretty hard when you're pretty jived up, but stellate ganglion block was a effective strategy for him.
I love this conversation because I'm learning things that I've never learned before. So thank you guys for sharing. I appreciate everyone being here. We have a question from Martinez. And I love this question because it shows the curiosity of our veterans and their willingness to come to the starting line. If I decide to put some effort into this, where do I start? This is often the scariest part for people, right?
Yes.
Therman, what do you think about that question?
Wow, that's a good one because, like I said, for me, it was everything falling apart, So, and I wanted to change my life, really. I said, gee, I'm getting older and I need to do something about it, because I had my kids, I had sports that they were into and stuff, and it took my mind off of it. Mm-hmm. And so, but that's a good question because you have to want to start someplace. And the best place I would suggest is going to the vet center or Martinez.
Yeah, like that. I like that.
But I like the simplicity of the vet centers. You walk in there, you see other guys moving around. Well, half of them are so old, it's hard to move around. But that's for me. That's only me.
Therman likes the vet centers. I don't blame you. I think that's where I started my mental health journey. For our folks at the VA, if I wanted to walk into that VA hospital, if I wasn't intimidated and I was going to walk in, where do I go?
Yeah, you start by having an intake in mental health, and I believe it would be the same at Martinez, where someone's going to look at all the different issues because it could be some underlying medical issues. So we want to get you hooked up with a doctor if you don't have a primary care physician, and then see if there's anxiety, depression. And sometimes people don't know if it's PTSD or major depressive disorder, or maybe there's some psychosis or something else. And so have a very thorough workup We then do a treatment plan, and then there's group treatment, individual treatment. There's also couples treatment. I do tons of couples work. That's not always available everywhere, but often having that partner involved can be very useful. But Dr. Kixmiller, specific to Martinez?
I would say the same thing. They do have a mental health triage. It's a new, nice building. You can just show up and just say, I need to be seen by an intake person. We have some really great intake people. And then I would say that, like what Dr. Neavins is saying, there's all sorts of options, but what we're going to do is work with the veteran to tailor it to what works for you, the veteran. There's a variety. It's like a menu of options. And we have recommendations that we would give, but we're not going to do anything to a veteran that they don't want done. Meds are an option for some that's off the table, fine. That's completely the veteran's right, and we wouldn't push past that. So it really is meant to be a flexible, kind of collaborative way of approaching treatment, with us just trying to provide as many options. And sometimes that might mean, my team has a rec therapist and he takes people on hikes. And I know that Charmel in the Sacramento area is phenomenal with what they can do and get veterans together around really fun activities in the community where everyone feels supported with each other. Yet they're both very knowledgeable about post-traumatic stress and triggers, and they're completely able to manage that in kind of the environment where it might actually be triggering, which is one of the ways of kind of getting past it, is having it happen, managing it, and then kind of realizing you come out on the other side. The brain does change with that. And so there is real hope that these kinds of things can be, very manageable.
Yeah. And like anything else, and as it was implied in the question, it's about what you put into it. So if you just kind of come to us and say, help me, I can't do anything. We might give you some assignments. We might ask you to do some things that are uncomfortable. It does start with getting a little bit out of your comfort zone, but I see people every day make the changes that really help them. And if one thing doesn't work, we don't just say, you have to do it, keep hammering it. We need a different tool. Let's try something else. Right. And so it's really a very collaborative process. And, if you want to get the help, we're here to help you, and you can change and have a better, fuller life.
I love the messages that we're getting to our veterans here, which is come to the table ready to collaborate, but be patient because it's a process. And if you go into a VA hospital, just understand that you're going to have that intake process first before you go into the meat of the matter. So be patient and expect to do that. And if something's not working, bring that back and have that conversation and share, medication isn't working. Maybe there's something different that we can do here. Maybe we can ease you in. And like Therman said earlier, don't be afraid to grab somebody, grab a battle buddy, grab a family member, and have them go in with you, because as long as you can get yourself there, right, there's hope to do some real good work and get yourself in a better position, which is what we hope for all of our veterans who are watching tonight. So I really want to thank our guests for being here today, and thank you to my co-host Steve and to our guests who wrote in. That ends our conversation for the evening tonight. We want to show you some resources if you want to get more information about tonight's subject. Very important. But first, I want to take a moment to congratulate the Veterans Voices team on winning the Alliance for Community Media 2023 WAVE Award. We will continue to strive for excellence in the service of our veterans in our community. Thank you. We hope you've enjoyed our conversation about post-traumatic stress triggers tonight. We will leave you with some resources if you or someone you know is dealing with post-traumatic stress. You can talk to someone who understands post-traumatic stress 24 hours a day on the Veterans Crisis Line. Just dial 988 and press 1. The National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder is the world's leading center for research and education about post-traumatic stress. Find them at www.ptsd.va.gov. The Headstrong Project provides confidential, barrier-free, stigma-free mental health treatment for our military community. Reach them at theheadstrongproject.org. The National Association of County Veteran Service Officers is a great place to start accessing all the benefits you've earned as a veteran. Find a county veteran service officer near you at nacvso.org. Veterans Voices is brought to you in part by contributions from the Diablo Valley Veterans Foundation, dedicated to helping veterans near you, American Legion Post 246, honoring the tradition of the American Legion in Danville. If you would like to help sponsor Veterans Voices, you can donate to Veterans Voices, care of Diablo Valley Veterans Foundation. Get in touch with them at diabloveterans.org. To rewatch tonight's episode, check back on our homepage later this week or check your cable provider's schedule for rebroadcast times. You can also rewatch this episode and many others on our YouTube channel, Veterans Voices of Contra Costa, so be sure to subscribe. Our next show will air on Monday, April 10th at 7 p.m. We will be talking with veterans who have entered the world of professional sports. You won't want to miss it. To all of our veterans and their families, thank you for serving. To all of you who have tuned in tonight, thanks for watching and have a great evening.